Hi, and welcome to the second part of our discussion on climate change and business. In the first section, I sort of led you through the idea of risk assessment and how a business reflects on its exposure to different potential opportunities as well as challenges through climate change, whether that's the impairment of their raw material sources or potential water shortages, or what they're going to do if a carbon tax is affected. So I want to explore that idea a little bit further and then talk about some of the major players nationally and internationally that help develop climate policy and how businesses are trying to become a member at the policy table so that things turn out that as initiatives and strategies sort of emerge, that they will be the most beneficial for their business models. So I think I left you with positing for 3 different industries of how climate change may impact their respective businesses. And I asked you to just kind of jot that down, and there's no right or wrong answer. Everybody's going to have something different, but that's kind of where we left last time. I asked you to think about this. So with agriculture, obviously weather's everything. So one of the sample risks there would have been drought and flood and erosion and our aquifers being impacted. Obviously, that's a pretty big issue everywhere. Increased toxins as our pesticides continue to build up in our soil becomes leached. There's human health ramifications. So there's lots of obvious risks for the ag industry as climate change accelerates. With insurance, it's a whole different ballpark or ball game in that the way insurance companies have always modeled their premiums or developed premiums is based on this concept of a pool of risk. And so I charge everybody, $100 a year, and maybe the risk is one person gets sick and I have to pay out. But as we know now, with climate change and all the chaos that's happening with wildfires and floods and major cities that are below sea level are having lots of stormwater issues, it's become an industry that, with the increased claims, and we'll see this on the next slide, are having to really sort of revamp what their products look like, because it's more like when we pay you out, not if we pay you out. And then with tourism, I think I asked you to think about this in the context of Western Montana. Of course, things like skiing are going to have potentially shorter seasons and higher altitude. Things like, golfing and hiking and camping and things that are more warm weather activities, probably longer seasons. But then we also know, for example, our rivers are warming, and that's not sustainable for our cold water fisheries. So lots of shifts to think about. So what I was trying to do is stimulate your thinking. It doesn't matter what industry sector you're in, you're going to have to go through the thought process with your team as you write your climate action plan and think about what the specific risks are to your organization. This is back just because it's such an interesting area, a little bit more about insurers and reinsurers. And this word reinsure I believe there's 3 of them in the world, and they are these incredibly wealthy companies that essentially insure the insurers. So, you and I write our premiums out to, Western Skies or Payne West or Prudential, and they provide us, or State Farm or whatever, they provide us with insurance, but they actually are insured by another one of these huge companies called reinsurers, and they are the ones that have been paying out the tens of billions for all of the climate reparation that's been happening the last couple decades. So this was a quote that I pulled from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners that basically says they are no longer selling a risk aversion product, but protection against the inevitable. So you can imagine when that's the kind of market they're in, what's happening to the pricing of their premiums and how that's impacting not only us individually, but how businesses price their products because the cost of that overhead flows through. So there's 5 different elements of risk assessment for a business, any business. So let's just take something that a kind of business that we all know. Let's say that I make Harley Davidsons, and they're headquartered in Milwaukee. It's a 120-year-old company, 130-year-old company. And they're conducting their climate change risk assessment. So they have their team there. They've got, production and marketing and accounting and HR and tech and research and development. The whole team's reflected as part of this risk assessment. And they're looking at these 5 components of risk. Physical risk is what's the actual potential human health ramifications of continuing to do business as we are now. Are there toxicity issues? Is there exposure to disease, to COVID? Of course, we heard about so many of our low-income workers during COVID that had to continue to go to work. Is there a heat intolerance issue that might arise with our workers? So Harley Davidson, most of their plants are here in America, but they get some of their sub-assemblies, right, small components from overseas. So they may feel that there's a potential of physical risk to some of their employees overseas. And how would they ratchet that in? How would they mitigate that? Well, they might somehow bring all their manufacturing back here. Regulatory risk. Regulatory risk is what is my exposure as a company to legislation changing, and I'm now going to be regulated in a way that's going to cost me more money. So my production plants, the United States government mandates that we now get 60% of our energy from renewable sources. That's going to cost me more money. That's going to drive up the production of my Harley Davidsons. That's an example of a regulatory risk that pertains to climate change. A fixed asset risk, I can't really think of an example of that with Harley Davidson. Let me just tell you what this means in general. Stranded assets for a company is assets that they can no longer use, that become valueless to them because of something attributable to climate chaos. So the easiest example is fossil fuel companies have all this fossil fuel that's still under the Earth's crust. And these assets, if they're not brought up if they're not harvested and brought to their crust and burned and used for energy, sold and burned for energy, they're valueless under the Earth's crust. That's a stranded asset. And any business person in the world is not going to want any of his or her assets stranded. So this is one of the hugest issues with fossil fuel companies, is there's still trillions of dollars of stranded assets under the Earth's crust. And so obviously, even though CEOs of fossil fuel companies are now acknowledging climate change and even anthropogenic climate change, which we know is human accelerated, that's what that means. Their duty to their shareholders is to try to get those assets out of the Earth's crust. Product risk is there something about my product that may be accelerating climate change and therefore be unpalatable to consumers or shareholders down the road? And obviously with the Harley Davidson, it's a fuel burning It's a fuel burning mode of transportation. So the product risk is that, single stroke and double stroke engines become obsolete. Nobody wants to drive anything that requires fossil fuels. And then competitive risk is what kinds of like-kind products are coming onto the marketplace that may displace my product line with a newer, cleaner, greener model. And I guess I don't really know anything per se about electric vehicle development around motorcycles, but I know that it's obviously in both the over-the-road, long haul trucks and pickup trucks and electric vehicles are all being developed at very rapid paces. So a climate change risk assessment is when your team sits down and says, what are all the things we can think of in these 5 categories? And then what's the most dangerous? What's the one that's going to bring us the highest level of risk? And then this is what we need to dial into to figure out how to ratchet back that risk, how to meet that risk, how to strategize to come up with a plan that's going to not just make us obsolete if that risk actually comes to fruition. And one of the ways to start doing that, we've learned about this in almost every aspect of this class, you need to do a baseline assessment, which means to go into your organization and say, using this really complex model or spreadsheet, I guess, called the greenhouse gas protocol, measuring your emissions. Where are we mostly, where most of our emissions are embedded carbon coming from? So if all my parts were coming from Asia, every single thing that goes on my Harley has been shipped across the ocean using fuel. That's a very, very high carbon footprint and a lot of risk, because at some point, if fossil fuels become very, very expensive and I can't get a hold of any of my raw materials or sub-assemblies in my own country, that's very, very high risk for me. So baseline assessment using this, this was the protocol used to do the University of Montana's greenhouse gas assessment. So you should be familiar with the kinds of things that measures, right? The 3 scopes. And then turning to the Carbon Disclosure Project for guidance as to how to move forward. And what this is, the Carbon Disclosure Project is a group. Let me just go through here to this next one. It's a group of companies that all have reported in what they've done around carbon reduction efforts. What's worked, what hasn't worked, what are their benchmarks? How did they motivate their employees? How did they measure their success? So it's survey data from companies that have actively engaged in carbon reduction strategies, and they've put the information out there so other companies that are trying to reduce their emissions and reduce their exposure to risk can also utilize what they've learned. So this is a super, super helpful resource for businesses. I did want to go back and get this one. So at the end of the process, from that prior slide where you've gone through the risk assessment and you've said, oh my gosh, like competitive risk and stranded asset risk are my 2 most highest levels of risk as associated with climate change. Now what do I do? And for a lot of organizations, to be honest, and we've all heard about this so much, it's a very, very current topic. On the back end of COVID, we've seen this very, very crucial supply chain crush, where we have not been moving products globally from one country to the next very expeditiously. And so if my company is reliant on a bunch of things coming from, wherever, Kenya or Taiwan or wherever, and they're not coming into port and being delivered to my warehouse, my business model is pretty much, stopped in its tracks. So maybe I need to, instead of relying on foreign manufacturers that are cheaper, I maybe need to invest in building my own small local US-based manufacturing plants. Okay, the product raw material might be a little bit more expensive, but I'm not at the mercy of supply chain crunches. I might modify my fleet. We hear a whole bunch about that from big players like Amazon and Hertz and FedEx, that they're going to have all EV or electric vehicle fleets by 2030, 2035. So just, what do my facilities look like as I build new facilities? Am I going to build them, utilizing old coal-fired power plant energy, or am I going to build them to access green technologies? So the risk assessment helps me look into the future and say, how am I going to devise my business in a way that I'm less likely to have that risk manifest itself? So commerce is businesses, commerce are very, very interested in getting direction as to what is getting directives as to where climate change policy is going to go. They hate uncertainty. Businesses hate uncertainty. It makes them very uncomfortable. They want to look into the future with some clarity and ability to say, what's the environment, or what's it going to look like in 10 or 20 years? Paint me a picture of where I'm going to be getting my energy, how I'm going to be moving my products, how I'm going to be packaging them and shipping them, right? So, and much of this, as you can see, is wrapped up in climate change policy. So what do businesses want? They want something simple and transparent so that all businesses have to follow the same rules and are measured by the same rules. They want to have some idea about what their energy is going to cost, and is it going to be affordable? We know that we have passed something called peak oil, where we know there's still trillions of dollars of fossil fuels in the Earth's crust, but it's much more difficult and expensive to get to than it used to be. The wells are deeper. They're in the Arctic. They're they're deep water. So we've got to have oceanic drilling units. And what this is, peak oil being behind us, means that oil is not going to do anything but get more expensive in the future. They want some predictability, just all the things that you and I want in our own lives too, about where's our food coming from, where's our energy coming from, where's our water coming from. We want predictability and transparency and fairness. So what do these policies look like? Well, at this point, they're primarily adaptational. And what that means is even the biggest naysayers 5 or 10 years ago are having to say, yes, climate change is real. It is probably anthropogenic, and it's here. So what are we going to do about it? We need to move people on island nations to higher ground. We need to build bigger seawalls around our low-lying communities. We need to accelerate pollution control devices on our power plants and our emitters. We need to get all of our buildings super energy efficient. So really, these adaptation policies is what business is looking to now. And all of this was just to kind of bring this into the current period, this was all really at the heart of the conversations that we studied about with COP26 in Glasgow. How do we as an international community come to the aid of developing nations as they the ramifications of climate change is very, very heavy for many of them, even though they did very little to contribute to them. I mean, many of them are very small nations in Micronesia or heavily populated countries like Bangladesh, but they're the whole country's under sea level. So You know, and you can't relocate 200 million people into India that don't have cultural similarities. So what are we doing with this $100 billion a year in the Green Climate Fund that came out of Glasgow? And these are some of the things we're looking at. And businesses are interested in this too, because many businesses will capitalize on, you know, building the seawalls and putting the catalytic converters in and doing the building retrofits. So this is all of really high interest to corporate America. So what kinds of players are at the policy table? So back to Harley-Davidson. I'm the CEO of Harley-Davidson. I'm very interested in what climate change policy is going to do to my business, or how it's going to impact the future of my organization. Who am I all looking at, or who's a piece of the policy players manual for me? Well, clearly my investors. Okay, publicly held company. Individual investors are just people like me. Every month I put $200 in my 401k, and I invest in the stock market with that $200 a month. And what kinds of businesses do I choose to put my $200 a month into? And how do I evaluate how well they're positioning themselves for the future? So in the past, somebody like me with my little $200 a month, absolutely no power, zero power, nobody cared about me. What's new and different in the last decade or so is that all of us small investors can come together. And once you hit a 51% ownership, all of these small investors collectively can become activist shareholders and push our companies that we own together collectively to make moves to address how they operate under the umbrella of climate change. And are they being responsible, and are they being proactive? So individual investors now really have a spot at the table, whereas that never occurred before. Institutional investors, conversely, are very, very large net worth, high impact investors. For example, the California Public Employee Retirement System. It's called CalPERS. So it's everybody's retirement money from all the public employees in the state of California. This one asset pack called CalPERS may have, I don't know, $75 billion in it. So when they come to the table and say, hey, Harley-Davidson, we've been investing in you because we think you're a good American stock and good American company, but you're not even talking about getting off of fossil fuels as you move into the future with your research and design. I don't know that that's going to work for us. You don't feel positioned for the future. So institutional and individual investors at the table. Corporate affiliations, that's groups, just networks of high impact corporations that come together to try and pressure public officials and policymakers. And many companies, I don't know if Harley's in INCR or some of the other big playing corporate affiliations, but they're the who's who of big companies that are working together, again, combining their power to influence policy. The Supreme Court, highest judicial body in the country, we're going to look at something that's in front of them right now that's going to have some very far-ranging impacts. Legislators at all levels, from international down to our little local city councils and mayors, and then some of the big cabinet areas of the United States government, right? The DOD, the DOT. So all these groups are at the policy table. This is one of those investor networks I was talking about, where companies come together, 200 different groups, $47 trillion in assets. That's a pretty unimaginable number for most of us. But these are those institutional investors that have come together, merged their funds, and are really very impactful, working with legislators to reduce regulatory uncertainty. In other words, tell us where we're going, tell us what's happening, become transparent, And then secondly, and this is super critical, they want to be provided incentives for pursuing solutions. And in the business world, incentive is double speak for tax credit. So if I'm Harley Davidson and I'm saying, okay, every new manufacturing facility, warehouse, distribution facility, everything I build from here forth will be 100% powered by solar energy. But you know what I want? I want the US government to give me a 10% tax credit on all my new facilities to help put those up. That's the kinds of incentives for solutions that these businesses want. And their goal is obviously to minimize that risk that we just looked at. Shareholders, as I just spoke earlier about, are at the policy table. And for the first time, us little guys are being able to take on big companies like Exxon and Conoco and Massey and say, you know what? 51% of us are going to become activist shareholders and pressure the board of directors to make change. And what we're going to say, the leverage we have is if you don't make the change that we're asking for as pertains to fracking or water policy or waste disposal or fossil fuels or sexual harassment, if you don't answer to our requests, we are going to vote you out, because that's what shareholders do, right? They choose the board of directors. And by default, we're going to impact the management team because the board of directors selects the management team. So all of a sudden, these activist shareholders have been increasingly engaging in these shareholder resolutions and actually winning and changing practices in some of these big companies over things like water and making sure that they're doing sustainability reporting, linking executive compensation to attaining sustainability metrics, right? Normally, executive compensation, the big bonuses, you get your $5 million a quarter if the stock price does X. Well, how about if you get your $5 million a quarter if you ratchet back carbon by 2%, right? So tying their compensation to water, waste, emissions, things that are sustainability related, shareholders are pressuring them to do it. This is pretty exciting stuff. And this is actually happening with more frequency. Okay, so then now we move to legislation, right? At the state, local, national, international level. And I mean, this could be a whole class practically, but one of the biggest things I'm sure you've all heard a bunch about, I think 2010, 2011, Obama's first term in office, he passed the Clean Power Plan, which was a very big, overarching attempt to ratchet back carbon about a third below 2005 levels by the year 2030. So this was the baseline. And what the Clean Power Plan says is we're going to ratchet back our emissions a third less than they were in 2005, and we're going to do that by 2030. And it basically looked at power plants to do that. And one of the things, I'm sure you've heard about it in Montana, one of the things that is very impactful here as pertains to the Clean Power Plan is that our power plants are in Colstrip, Montana, and 2 of them are quite old and they don't meet the standards as set by the Clean Power Plan. So part of the ramifications of this is these plants are going to need to close. Well, what immediately happened after this was passed into law was 27 states filed lawsuits. All of these have got right-leaning attorney generals, and they filed a lawsuit against the Clean Power Plan in federal court. And the Supreme Court placed a stay, meaning that they were that the plan could not go into effect while these cases were being heard. And in October of 2017, the EPA director, Scott Pruitt, who was a member of the Trump administration and the only the only EPA officer in our entire history that came from the oil and gas industry. So, you know, process that. The person that was in charge of protecting our environment is from the oil and gas industry. He signed a rule overriding the Clean Power Plan. So where are we at now? And again, there's so much to talk about here, but two kind of exciting things that have happened very recently. The infrastructure package was signed into law in November of 2021, and it's about $1 trillion bill. A lot of it has to do with upgrading our, you know, passenger rail systems and our bike lanes and our shipping shipping lanes, and just making our transportation and movement of goods infrastructure stronger, greener, cleaner, and poised for the 21st century. So this was super long overdue. I think something like 80 odd years since the New Deal passed. This is one of the biggest pieces of legislation that deal with greening and updating our infrastructure. On the backside of that is the Build Back Better Act, which is a human infrastructure bill. It deals with updating Medicare and Medicaid. It deals with childcare. It deals with a national preschool so that our young kids, particularly from low-income households, have access to equal opportunity. And very importantly, a significant piece of this bill is directly related to climate resiliency and helping whole cities like New Orleans and Miami that are below sea level remediate and become resilient in the face of climate change. So it's in the House, or it just passed if it's passed the House of Representatives, it's going to the Senate. Obviously will probably be ratcheted back quite significantly. And then we'll see if it passes and goes on to be signed into law. So that's what's happening from a legislative standpoint currently. What's happening at the Supreme Court is a whole nother animal. So as you well know, when laws are contested, they can go through a series of different courts, from local courts to state courts to appellate and circuit courts, and only the most highly contested laws end up in front of the Supreme Court, and then they can decide whether to hear them or not. And what is currently on the docket is not only a law that's being contested that can, well, obviously change the Clean Power Plan or make it obsolete, but it will change the future of the ability of the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant. So this is huge. On the docket, West Virginia versus the EPA. There's actually 6 or 7 states that are also contesting this, but it's all being heard as one case. They're fighting to get the court to rule that Obama's plan should never have been authorized. It violated the Clean Air Act. And most significantly, what this is doing is restricting the EPA's ability in the future to regulate greenhouse gases. And I mean, this is so incredibly pivotal if this court rules that in favor of West Virginia, if the court rules as such, the federal government will lose the ability to regulate really in perpetuity greenhouse gas emissions. So Neil Gorsuch, of course, is one of the newer Supreme Court justices. We have a conservative leaning Supreme Court, very concretely conservative leaning. There's no in between anymore. And as Ian Millhiser tells us, that this is not only has the potential to, as he says, gut the government's power to fight climate change, but also to regulate air health, water health, soil health into the future with the wording. And Gorsuch has also been very active prior to being a Supreme Court nominee in promulgating this kind of thought. So stay tuned. It's a pretty big deal. So that's what's going on nationally. Internationally, of course, we know the Paris Accords passed in 2015, requiring each country that was there to set aggressive standards to work towards ratcheting back their carbon emissions. The only two countries that held out at the time were Syria and Nicaragua. But the next year, when Trump came into office, he promptly withdrew us from the agreement. And so we were technically the only country in the whole world that weren't in the Paris Accord, because Syria and Nicaragua came to the table later. When Joe Biden was elected, he reaffirmed our commitment to the Paris Accord. And of course, we were very active in Glasgow at COP26. The intent of the world coming together was to solidify our global commitment to emission reduction. And this is a really important link too. If you're interested in some of the different outcomes, a lot of people are like, oh, okay, everybody flew in around the globe and what was actually achieved. And you can see each of these are the tangible results. How is COP26 dealing with human health, or moving towards zero emission vehicles, or green shipping, or we've got to come to a carbon free aviation fuel. What are we doing with ag? You can read this, just transition that refers to making sure it's equitable between people of different races and parts of the globe. So these are, coal to clean power. These are all subsets of the tangible action plans that came out of COP 26. And then lastly, this just sort of ties into international policy and this is the end of the discussion on the different players at the policy table and how this all fits into a business's ability to assess their risk around climate change and to move forward with some sort of, clarity or assuredness that they're making choices that are going to help them profitably move into the middle of the 21st century. So this piece is a little dated, but it's still really salient, and I'll explain why. You were supposed to read this, and this is one of your pivotal readings, so do this. It's from two scientists at Princeton. I think it was published in like 2006, so it's 15 years old now. But basically what they said is the world possesses the technologies right now to stabilize emissions. Like, it's not pie in the sky stuff. It's not geoengineering. It's not this whole series of things we don't know how to do. We actually own all these technologies right now. And there's no single magic bullet, but there's different categories of reduction. And what we need to, and each wedge represents 1 billion tons of carbon per year. So we need to choose some of these wedges and just get after them. And if we do that, we globally do that, we actually can stabilize emissions. And it's like this roadmap, right, for reducing CO2. And the wedges are really simple. The scary thing about it is when we first saw this in 2006, I believe we were told that we needed to choose four of them possibly, or 5 of them, to get to that maintaining our Celsius temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, right? That's what we've been told, over and over and over. We've got to hold our temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. And obviously we're on track to blow that out of the water. But In 2006, when we first saw this, we were told you need to do, I think, 4 or 5 of these wedges. Now we know we need to choose 7 or 8 of them to stabilize at 2 degrees. But the beauty of this is with any sort of global unity, these wedges exist. So some are in ag and forestry, right? How do we till our soil? Do we churn it all up and emit carbon, or do we engage in low tillage practices? And we literally have to stop deforesting our planet. They're the lungs of the earth. They sequester carbon naturally, right? So that's one set of wedges. Alternative energy is another set of wedges, right? Just what you would imagine, wind and solar and hydrogen, okay? Alternative energies. Carbon capture and storage, CCS, it's a whole set of technology where we capture emitted carbon and we store it in the oceans, or we store it underground, or we store it in carbon sinks. This refers to ratcheting back our coal-fired plants, which these 2 wedges is what the Clean Power Plan was trying to accomplish, was replacing coal-fired plants with gas-fired plants, or replacing them with renewables. And then user efficiency and conservation, of course, that's the cheapest, that's the easiest. That's just use less energy, make your building envelopes tight. Make your businesses tight. So, just cutting electric usage. So these are called stabilization wedges. And that piece by Sakalau, Dr. Sakalau and Dr. Pekala, very, very pivotal piece. I hope you really spend some time with that. So at the end of the day, for businesses, you have to ask yourself, how are your clients? How is your supply chain? How is are your employees and your communities going to look in a severely carbon constrained environment? What's that going to look like? And are you establishing a way for your company to be poised to thrive in that environment? So I hope this has been helpful. If you have anything that you want to discuss with me, please let me know directly. And I look forward to seeing your discussions in the forum around this. So thank you very much. Bye.